cultural evolution. So in this lecture, we want to talk about the theoretical paradigm of cultural evolution, highly influential in anthropology. Cultural evolution, as we're talking about, refers to this process of development, change, and transmission of different cultural traits, ideas, practices, and behaviors within human societies through time. So it's the study of how societies adapt, innovate, and pass on non-genetic information, from one generation to the next. This includes the transformation of human ways of life. That can include things like language, technology, social norms, beliefs, and institutions. A key thinker associated with cultural evolutionary thinking is Lewis Henry Morgan, highly influential thinker. For Morgan, like other cultural evolutionists like Herbert Spencer, societies evolved in a manner analogous to the evolution of species. They undergo a process of natural selection, with successful traits being passed down through generations. So Morgan's Ancient Society, published in 1877, its really famous introduction on ethnical periods, makes this argument that all human societies are going to progress through a series of linear and unidirectional evolutionary stages. Earliest stages being things like savagery, intermediate stages being things like barbarism, and then finally a kind of endpoint of this evolutionary process would be civilization. And so for Morgan, the work of anthropology was to describe human populations, that is, classify cultural traits, technology, and so on, and then to place them based on those descriptions into one or other of these stages. Key work of Morgan's was Houses and House Life of the American Aborigines. So this was published in 1881. And so in this text, Morgan is looking at the architectural and domestic aspects of indigenous Native American communities. He describes and classifies houses and house forms, provides information about their structure, their details. He then describes the domestic life and social organization of the people who use them. And in doing so, he tries to trace the development of house types through time. And he's trying to make connections between, let's say, architectural forms and social organization, and then architectural changes and broader cultural evolutionary processes. He argued that the types of houses people build are indicative of that stage they are in on cultural evolution. So for savages, in Morgan's perspective, these societies will live in simple, temporary dwellings. And in contrast, civilized societies are going to build more advanced architectural forms, larger, more complex dwellings, and establish urban centers. In this next clip from World on Display, look at the first-person and scholarly accounts from the World's Fair of 1904. This was the St. Louis World's Fair. Look at how American civilization is represented. Look at how evolution is presented. Look at how cultural traits are represented. This was a popularization, really, of cultural evolutionary thinking.
The fair's directors brought more than 1,000 indigenous peoples to live in villages at the fair, continuing a tradition which had begun with colonial displays at 19th century World's Fairs.
They begin in the 1867 Universal Exposition in Paris. It's there for the first time that we see indigenous villages built as urban design complexes outside the main exhibition. It is in this fair that we encounter for the first time a dual structure. The center of the exhibition grounds is reserved for the more advanced Western nations in buildings that are designed according to the Beaux-Arts manner. Around this symmetrical Beaux-Arts structure, we get a picturesque garden where indigenous villages, non-Western cultures are represented together with the more entertainment-oriented pavilions that belong to Western cultures. The villages were populated by so-called indigenous people who were shipped to Europe and to America in order to represent the entirety of cultures. Again, first in a didactic way, later as pure entertainment. But craftsmen were brought in so that they would practice their crafts in front of European audiences. Musicians were brought in, and dancers. In fact, belly dancing became one of the biggest attractions of the World's Fair from 1889 on.
Representations of non-Western cultures became an integral part of 19th century fairs. Visitors to the 1889 exposition in Paris could walk through reconstructed villages from Senegal or New Caledonia inhabited by real natives. They could watch Algerian women weave rugs and peer inside Bedouin tents. At the Universal Expositions of 1889 and 1900, fairgoers rode an electric elevator to the top of the Eiffel Tower and looked down on pavilions from French colonies in Africa and Asia. This dual structure of Beaux-Arts architecture contrasted with native villages, became the common language of World's Fair planners on both sides of the Atlantic. At Buffalo's Pan-American Exposition of 1901, visitors strolled through sculpture gardens and exhibition palaces, then watched Eskimos give demonstrations of leapfrog and snap the whip. At the St. Louis Fair, this juxtaposition of primitivism and civilization expressed both the development of the western United States since the Louisiana Purchase and America's new role as an imperial power.
Well, the St. Louis Fair had several aims. It's hard to talk about one aim. It seems to me there are two that need to be stressed. On the domestic front, one of the aims was to build the interior market. The fair, after all, was held to commemorate the Louisiana Purchase, and the exposition was in many ways about possibilities of water reclamation for developing the American West with St. Louis as its hub. But I think the overriding purpose of the fair really centered on an effort to promote America's new role as an overseas imperial power. Well, vital to the overall strategy of convincing Americans that an overseas empire was a worthy endeavor were representations of people who were likely subjects and were in fact in 1904 subjects. So you had at the fair representations of Native Americans juxtaposed to representations of Filipinos, and the idea that exposition sponsors wanted to get across was that there was continuity between America's history of removing and relocating Native peoples within the United States and organizing the lives of people overseas, especially in the Philippines. There was, if you will, historical continuity in America's imperial past, present, and future.
The Philippine Reservation covered 47 acres, making it the largest exhibit at the fair. To reach the reservation, visitors crossed over a bridge spanning Arrowhead Lake, then entered through a reproduction of the walls surrounding Manila. More than 1,000 Filipino soldiers and tribesmen were brought to St. Louis to live in 5 native villages and a military encampment. Model schools, similar to those on Indian reservations, demonstrated how Filipino children were being guided along the road to civilization. Visitors watched from an observation gallery as American-trained teachers went about their work. The Philippine Reservation was essential to the Anthropology Department's mission of showing the development of civilization. At the bottom of the evolutionary ladder with the short, dark Negritos, regarded as the most primitive Filipinos, and surely headed for extinction. One of the Negrito men became a popular subject for photographers who labeled him the missing link. Two groups of Filipinos occupied the high end of the ladder. One was the light-skinned Visayans, whose women dressed in lace gowns. The other was the Philippine Scouts and the Constabulary, paramilitary forces trained by the American Army. In one exhibit, 3 photographs were used to supposedly show the evolution of a Filipino tribesman from savagery to civilization, that is, to a post in the constabulary. The Scouts' demonstrations of marching and close order drill provided a striking contrast to the native dances of their fellow countrymen. The Bagobos and the Igorots, 2 tribes anthropologists regarded as capable of being civilized, were placed somewhere in the middle of the evolutionary scale. Bagobos wore elaborately detailed costumes. Igorots, relatively little. 2 sisters from Massachusetts, Sarah and Elizabeth Metcalf, became fascinated with the Bagobos and took a number of snapshots of each other and their friends posing with them. They followed the Bagobos to the 1905 exposition in Portland, Oregon, and eventually set up a business to import Filipino musical instruments into the United States. But for visitors to the fair, no group among the Filipinos proved more popular than the Igorots. In spite of their reputation as fierce headhunters, they seemed to adjust to their temporary life in the human zoo.
The people of all sorts and descriptions, all their displays, and I don't remember them pointedly, but they were all there. And the only one I remember about was about the Igorots. My Uncle Walter was here from England to visit the fair, and my father took him out there, and he told me about seeing the Igorots. They had a special background for them, a setup there, a raised, and my Uncle Walter began talking to them in their native language, and they just were so happy. They just smiled and were so glad to have somebody talk to them. And my father said it was just a lot of clicking noises. It wasn't really words expressed, but that was their language, and he knew it.
Of course, anthropology played such a terrific role as an organizing discipline for the fair. Some of the intellectual underwriters of the fair were some of America's best-known anthropologists, W.J. McGee from the Smithsonian, and of course there was Frederick Starr from the University of Chicago, who journeyed to the fair and actually organized a summer school course in anthropology. Students could go to the fair, they could see the village concessions on the Pike, they could go to the Philippines Reservation and receive college credit for learning about anthropology. And within the overall context of the fair, it was hard to miss this idea of evolutionary, hierarchically conceived progress between representations of something called savagery and something else called civilization. The white city itself was civilization, culture, manifest, and the representations of indigenous peoples. Exactly.
You can see also cultural evolutionary thinking in this clip from World on Display is tied to ideas of diffusionism, so that allied to cultural evolutionary thinking was that cultural traits can move from one society to another through things like migration, things like trade, things like contact. So some diffusionists did recognize that different peoples could independently invent a cultural trait that is shared with other groups. But they insisted that once that cultural trait is invented, it's going to spread through diffusion to other societies if it's adaptive. And so some of the traits that have been talked about by diffusionists are things like agriculture, things like industrialization, things like digital technology. In the clip from World on Display, you see things like clothing and weaponry, also used as examples of diffusionist traits. In anthropology, though, these ideas have been critiqued. In fact, the founding of academic American anthropology sort of comes out of a critique of evolutionary thought. So the founder of American anthropology, the establisher of the first academic or university anthropology program, Franz Boas at Columbia University, was a prominent critic of evolutionism. He believed evolutionary thought was too broad of a generalization of entire cultures and culture areas in a kind of diffusionist sense. He emphasized that anthropologists approach these kinds of issues through a more relativistic lens. The idea that, well, each group of people and their culture should be understood in their own terms, in their own particular historical context, in their own particular environmental context. And this really becomes a foundational principle in modern anthropology, and why many anthropologists today are hesitant to use evolutionary thinking to explain human behavior, to explain human differences. For Boas, each culture has a unique historical trajectory. The development of their cultural traits can't be reduced to some naturalized pattern of evolution that's occurring to all peoples. He rejects this. He thinks that that's an ethnocentric idea, that served Europeans in their global political economy, their global imperialism, their global colonialism, and this idea that Europeans reflected civilization, this pinnacle of cultural evolution, was a perfect example of this. He wanted anthropologists to be better than that, to get outside of their own ethnocentrism and approach these cultures within their own terms, rather than projecting a model from our own culture, that is, this evolutionary framework, onto them. That said, these ideas of evolution and historical particularism do come together later in the post-war period. And I think any evolutionary thinking, whether that's biological or whether that is cultural in anthropology today, sort of genealogy comes out of this post-war multilinear evolution. So in multilinear evolution, associated with a thinker like Julian Stewart that you see depicted here, different societies follow different paths of cultural development. He's still using a kind of naturalized, biologized kind of idea of evolution, but that there is no unitary and linear path that all human societies are going to come through or pass through, but that each society is going to develop in its own way dependent on its environmental and historical circumstances. They are going to adapt to different environmental, different geographical, different kinds of historical conditions. And so you can see this kind of merging of evolutionary thinking with historical models of change. In this next video clip, you're going to see the biologist and geographer Jared Diamond and his work on guns, germs, and steel. And it's a good reflection of kind of multilinear evolutionary thought in the contemporary period. It really is an attempt to understand cultural differences, particularly between oceanic societies like Papua New Guinea and those of Europe and North America. And he's interested in, why did Europeans become so dominant? Why didn't we see other groups like Chinese or the Inca become more dominant instead? Why didn't cities first evolve in South America? Why do we not see agriculture in Australia? And why do we see poverty today at high rates in certain parts of the world? And so for Diamond, he brings this kind of evolutionary thought, and he starts to try to trace and explain this through reference to ecological, environmental, geographical kinds of issues and problems, thus situating himself as a contemporary kind of modern face, if you will, of multilinear evolutionary thinking.
Modern history has been shaped by conquest. The conquest of the world by Europeans. The conquistadors led the way. A few hundred men who came to the New World and decimated the native population. The secret of their success? Guns, germs, and steel. Ever since, people of European origin have dominated the globe with the same combination of military power, lethal microbes, and advanced technology. But how did they develop these advantages in the first place? Why did the world ever become so unequal?
Over the years, I've gotten to know and like thousands of New Guineans.
The name belong again, you talk? Name Yanai.
I've learned several of their languages, and much of what I know about birds I picked up from them.
Because of hard work.
There have been people living in New Guinea for at least 40,000 years. Much longer than on the continents of North and South America. Oh, look 'em. Look 'em, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pella. They're among the most culturally diverse and adaptable people in the world. So why are they so much poorer than modern Americans?
The question was put to Diamond bluntly by a man called Yali, whom he met on a beach more than 30 years ago.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
Yali's question really threw me. It seemed so simple and obvious, and I thought it must have a simple and obvious answer. But when he asked me, I had no idea what that answer was.
Why you white men have so much cargo and we New Guineans have so little?
New Guineans use the word cargo to describe the material goods first brought to their country by Westerners. Cargo was regarded by many as evidence of the white man's power. It was treated with an almost religious reverence. For their part, Western colonials typically believed that power was determined by race. They saw themselves as genetically superior to the native population. To them, it was only natural that they should have so much cargo and New Guineans so little.
To me, any explanation based on race is absurd. I know too many really smart New Guineans to believe there's anything genetically inferior about them. It's their ingenuity and their quickness to learn that have always impressed me.
Now, rope, you pass them.
They can go empty-handed into some of the most difficult environments on Earth, knock up a shelter in a few hours and survive.
Me try him this pella step. This pella rope be strong and up and up and up and up.
I wouldn't know where to start. In this environment, I'd be helpless without them. So why didn't these ingenious people invent metal tools, or build great cities, or develop any of the other trappings of modern civilization? The world that I'm from is so different. The modern U.S. is the richest, most powerful state on Earth. It's crammed with more cargo than most New Guineans could ever imagine. But why? That's what Yali wanted to know. How did our worlds ever become so different?
So in conclusion, we've been talking about cultural evolutionary thought and anthropology, the attempt to explain human differences through reference to an evolutionary framework. We looked at the work of Lewis Henry Morgan, a key thinker in the development of cultural evolutionary thought, particularly linear evolution and stages from savagery to civilization. We've seen the legacy of this thinking in things like diffusionism, most widely seen seen in a subfield like archaeology, and we've seen critique, in particular the Boasian critique, in which the historical particulars of change and development are emphasized. The relative features of each population's own development in a historical sense are utilized, and kind of the biological metaphor, society as a biological species that's adapting, is rejected. And we'll talk more about this as the quarter continues.